Thank you. Apologies, we're running about 4 minutes late, so apologies for that. So my name is Luis Menezes, and I'm a board member of No to Violence, and I'll be chairing this session today. This will be split into 3 sessions. So this is just to make sure that you're all in the right room. This is Reimagining Masculinities. Welcome everyone present here, as well as welcome to those who are online. Our first session keynote is what are we saying? What do we need to be saying when reporting, commentating about men's violence? And I'd like to welcome our facilitator, Ginger Gorman, and our panelists, Jane Gilmore and Jane Carroll, to the couch. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. How's it all been going for the last few days? So I'm Ginger Gorman. It's so lovely to see you all. And just quickly before we get started, you'll see in the program the wonderful Jess Hill is mentioned. Now, unfortunately, she's quite unwell this morning. Jess she was part of the expert rapid review panel appointed by the Albanese government into best practice approaches, and that was a very, very stressful time for her, and all that's just been submitted, and we've now got those findings. But also, some of you may know, that came on the back of a really huge health issue for her that she's been battling with. So she's completely exhausted and she's got other work backed up. But it did make me think about, and I've definitely had these conversations with you, Jane G, about being an advocate and how hard it is sometimes, and how when you are in the advocacy space, you can get completely exhausted. So I just wanted to I've had that experience myself as well, like getting PTSD after doing advocacy in certain areas. So take care, everyone. Take naps when you need to. So I just want to acknowledge that we're on unceded land as well. I've been spending a lot of time with Indigenous elders in the Kimberley for my next book, and it's really teaching me about the profound connection that Indigenous folks have to country. So I just want to acknowledge from the bottom of my heart that we are on Aboriginal land that was never ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, and thank them for having us on their homelands. Storytelling is a really big part of Indigenous culture, so that's what we're going to be doing today. So,
Ginger, sorry, can I just interrupt for
yes.
1 sec there? One thing I always want to do after an acknowledgement is obviously reiterate it, but particularly when we're talking about domestic violence, actions matching words has to be something that we focus on, and so I try and encourage people. This, by the way, was inspired by Lydia Thorpe. I was on a panel with her. I said, I feel like the words are so tokenistic. What can I say instead? And she looked at me and went, I don't give a fuck what you say, pay the rent. And I thought, yeah, okay. So I now have an app open on my phone, or in the browser on my phone, for the Aboriginal Legal Service, and every time I hear an acknowledgement, I try and make a donation. Yeah. If I can't make a donation, I read something, follow someone, just try and do something that means that it's not just words for me, it's actions. Yeah. And the other thing I do is every time I have the opportunity to say this in public, I do, and encourage other people to also say that, to make that part of the acknowledgement, that it's about actions, not just words, so that that becomes a thing that we all have to do. Thank you for the opportunity to do that.
I could talk endlessly on that. One of the elders I've become friends with, Auntie TJ, she's always about give back. How are you going to give back? So, yeah, I love that. Thank you, Jane. So, listen, you don't need to look very far, do you, to see that there's something really wrong when it comes to masculinity and misogyny in our society. And this most obvious stat, which you may have already heard over the past few days, it's pointed to but remains absolutely gut-wrenching, and that is that at the moment, 1 woman is killed every 4 days by a current or former intimate partner. Used to be 1 a week, but things are getting worse in some ways, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are obviously tens of thousands of women and men actually living in unhealthy and controlling relationships, children as well. They're subjected to violence, fear and control in those homes as well. And, you know, I also read, and I think Jane C, you'll probably have some stuff to say about this in a minute, but this recent report of sexism in classrooms and young female teachers leaving because the sexual harassment is so extreme. And when you read the details of those articles, it's actually stomach-turning, some of that stuff. I could go on and on and on and on here, but these are all examples of rigid masculinity and gender norms. And I want to remember here as well that something we often forget is this is not good for men either. Okay, academic research into this area, decades of this stuff, right, links rigid gender norms with really unhealthy outcomes for men. So, including but not limited to suicide and self-harm and suicidality, drinking at dangerous levels, taking risks while intoxicated or drug-affected, problem gambling, and we could go on and on here as well. So this is a bad situation for all of us, no matter who we are and what our identity is. And so the question we're really looking at today, and I've got a dream team here, these two would be like on my list to invite. You know that game you play when you're a kid, like who are your dream dinner party guests? Like my feminist dream dinner party guests would include both of these two women and Jess as well. So joining me on the stage here, author and journalist Jane Gilmore, and social commentator and author Jane Caro. And I'm Ginger Gorman, so I'm a social justice journalist, cyber hate expert. I'm moderating today, but I'll also be sort of taking part in the discussion where it's relevant. So also, no men on this panel. How can we talk about masculinity without guys? I asked these guys this question a couple of days ago, and one of you, was that you, Jane G, sent me this amazing link. So Canadian feminist Liz Plank was asked this question, and she said to the guy who asked her, who was a male person of colour, she said, I can talk about masculinity in the same way that you can talk about whiteness, because when you are part of the oppressed group, it gives you a certain kind of expertise. So that's how we're answering that question today. All right. So if we're going to cast ourselves as masculinity doctors today, what do we think the problem is? What's wrong with the discourse? Jane C?
My most hated thing, romance. I fucking hate romance.
Do you see why I want Jane at my dinner party? She hasn't even had a drink yet.
No. Yeah, look, romance is such a ghastly, damaging, brutal set of myths. We talk about the chase. We talk about, catching a man, catching a woman, and that, of course, leads us to a situation where our ancient, ingrained idea of male-female relationships is predator and prey. Frankly, when I was writing The Mother, which is about a coercive, controlling relationship, when I went in, I've got two grandsons and a granddaughter, and when I was, doing the grandmotherly thing and buying the clothes their mothers can't afford, I'd go into these fancy, kids' clothes shops, and I would look at what was available for the boys and what was available for the girls, and it really struck me in researching coercive control how we groom our children from a very early age. If you look at the sorts of visual representations on little boys' clothing, it's wolves, sharks, robots, dinosaurs, predators. If you look at what we represent on little girls' clothing, and don't get me started about the fact it's really hard to buy sun-safe girls' clothing because the necks are really low and the sleeves are really small, and it's like we're getting them ready to be little seductresses and show off their body early. It's all fluffy kittens, chickens, squirrels, unicorns, bunny rabbits. Pray, ladies and gentlemen, pray. And I don't mean with an A, I mean with an E. And prayer, well, thoughts and prayers get you where America is this morning. Fucking nowhere. action is what matters, as Jane and Ginger were saying before. So for my money, that's in a way where it all begins. We also train from a very early age, I believe, men not to empathise with women. We actually are afraid of men empathising with women. So the work that's been done, for example, by Gina Davis in the institute she set up, Intermedia, about the portrayal of boys and girls, and she looked at how many female protagonists there were in Hollywood films, and at the time she started it, there was 17%, and that had gone up. The last time that had gone up was 1946, after they stopped making war movies, when it slightly improved. If you don't believe me, think about the children's film Finding Nemo, where there is only one female fish in the entire ocean and she can't remember her name from one minute to the next. I remember my daughters, when I was working in advertising, we saw a whole lot of a commercial break full of cereal ads, and my daughters turned to me and said, "Don't advertising people think girls eat cereal, Mum? This is all boys. It's all boys." And so we literally train men to not to empathise with women, but we train women to empathise with men. And that's why, for example, all of us have more of a struggle getting our books published. Female filmmakers have more of a struggle getting their films made. J.K. Rowling, I'm not a fan, but J.K. Rowling had to call herself J.K. Rowling, and she had to make the star Harry Potter, not Hermione Granger, because the publishers said to her, if you make it with a boy's name on it, you'll sell twice the number of copies. Men don't buy the books women write, they don't read the books women write, they don't watch the films, they don't go to see the plays, they don't go watch the TV series, chick flicks, all that crap. If you want to be a good ally, do that. Fucking buy those books, see those films. You know, the funny thing about that is radical action, and you'll actually enjoy it because they're fucking good.
That's also what Jane was saying about action. So many things you've said there, Jane C. I want to go to Jane G in a sec, but a couple of things. Has anyone read Mary Beard's book on women in power? I've just started reading it. Anyway, she's the very first text that's available to us, that's written down from 3,000 years ago. It's a man telling his middle-aged mother to shut up. So she is tracking back thousands of years the silencing of women, which I found interesting. And she's saying that today we're still told to shut up. Anyone on the internet here, most of you? If you're a woman online, you would have been told to shut up for sure. Now, the romance thing. This is Jane Gilmore's book, and I don't know why this isn't an absolute viral sensation. I've never laughed so much in all my life when I read this. So this is Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children. And when my kids were little, I think Beauty and the Beast came on the television, and I was furious. And my little girl said to me, "You don't like Beauty and the Beast, Mum?" And I was like, "No, because it's coercive control." And then Rapunzel, "You don't like Rapunzel, Mum?" And I'm like, "No, because she's trapped in a tower." And I had never really interrogated this until I read this book. Jane, tell us what's in this book, and then, I don't know, I would love you to read even just a little bit of your rewrite of Cinderella, because not only did it make me pee my pants laughing, but it's just brilliant because it actually makes clear the misogyny that we are imbibing every day from when we're little girls.
Thank you. Firstly, I'm not going to read out loud. I'm quite profoundly dyslexic and I can't read out loud, which is why I became quite a practiced public speaker, because you fly without a net. As far as the book's concerned, one of the many things I found fascinating when I was reading this book was the history of the book, the story of Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast occurs in almost every single culture around the world. So a lot of the fairy tales that we have are very specific to cultural descendants of Western Europe. Beauty and the Beast is in all of them, some version of it. In all of those versions, there is a father who sells his daughter or gives his daughter or is threatened or blackmailed into giving his daughter to a beast. The beast is actually a good man who was cursed by an evil old woman, because all old women are evil. And
it's true.
And she has to go and demonstrate to him how unselfish she is to turn him into the handsome prince. And when he doesn't turn into the handsome prince, when he's intimidating or aggressive or violent or angry, it's her fault for not loving him enough and not being unselfish enough. And that is essentially the story. When she does finally love him enough, he turns into the handsome prince and they live happily ever after. That's the Beauty and the Beast story. That is laying the foundations for coercive control so obviously that it's almost a bit vomit-making. But I remember watching the Beauty and the Beast movie when my kids were little and kind of rolling my eyes a bit and getting a bit ugh, but not really thinking through exactly what was in it. The number of things in it, the alienating the wicked old woman, who are always the biggest threat in all fairy tales. The wicked old woman is the biggest threat to the beautiful young girl. She is the one who curses her chances of her ultimate life goal, which is to win the handsome prince. She is a threat to that. And you think about the way, say, all of the people in this room and the work that we do, the vast majority of the work that is done to protect beautiful young girls or just women in general from dangerous men is done by older women. So yes, older women are absolutely a threat to the men who want to abuse women. Goddamn right we are, and proud of it.
Woohoo.
But patriarchy says to young women, don't trust old women, they're the danger. And there's a reason for that. When it says to women, men are not responsible for what they do. He is not responsible for his anger, for his aggression, for his violence and his control and his abuse and his humiliation of you. That was just what the evil old woman cursed him with, which is translation to his mother was mean to him, his last girlfriend was mean to him, you just have to love him better. Coercive control. It is an absolute recipe for coercive control, and this is a fairy tale we have been telling girls across all cultures across the world for thousands of years.
But we're telling men too. Like these Grimm brothers, like the original Grimm brothers. First of all, it is really grim if you've ever read them. They're shocking. But they're telling boys that too. You know, going back to your point about they're not the empathy. That is all embedded in there as well.
Well, the other thing, what will be the sequel to this book, is what I'm calling now warrior myths. So what we've always told young boys for thousands of years, because what we needed them to do was to either grow food or join an army and die on a battlefield. For thousands of years, that was what we needed 95% of men in the world to do, because that's how the powerful retain power. To get young men, young, healthy, strong men, to go out and choose to die on a battlefield, to choose to give up their lives for that, is it's an impossible ask unless you glorify it. So this is how you get the warrior myth and the brotherhood of soldiers. So not only are you forced onto the battlefield by this threat of you are a coward, you're weak, you're not strong enough to be a proper man, which is being the warrior. If you then get on the battlefield and look around and go, this is fucked, and leave, you are worse than that. You are a coward who left your brothers to die. That's the essence of what we now term rigid gender roles. That's the underlying myth behind it. And the reason for it was so that powerful men could convince young, healthy men to go and die for them, to maintain their power. And sitting next to that was the myth for women and girls of you need to venerating motherhood and fidelity to your warrior king.
Venerating motherhood until you get to be a wicked old woman.
Yes, and then you should, and then we burn you at the stake for being a witch.
But can I just add an aside about... Oh, sorry, you finished.
Yeah, so just very briefly, over the last 200 years, we have changed those myths for girls and women. We have said there are so many other things you can be. Look at all the things you can be. You can be Beyonce, you can be Hillary Clinton, you can be a goth, lesbian, shepherdess poet, and somebody will still be looking at you going, wow, that's awesome. We've given women and girls all these examples of what to be. We have not done that for boys and men. We still have the warrior myth, and that is all we have for them. And if you fail to meet that, the punishment is shame, which is the most destructive emotion possible to feel. Anger can be transcendent. Even violence occasionally can be transcendent in defence of others. Shame is always destructive, and we use shame to police men into this warrior myth mentality of masculinity and tell them that if they don't live up to it, you are a failure as a man, and the shame for that is punishable with violence and death. And that, to me, is the essence of what we're talking about. So as far as being able to undo that, the most powerful thing we can do is model other types of masculinity Just one last thing that I'll say very quickly. Dr. Emma Fulu, I would very strongly recommend you to look up her research. She did a study of domestic violence in Southeast Asian countries, and in the Maldives, masculinity was defined as being calm and dignified under pressure. So the more masculine you were, the more calm you are, the more reasonable you are, the more dignified you are. They had the lowest rates of any kind of violence, but particularly gender-based violence, of any country that she studied, and I'm pretty sure there's a connection there.
One of the other things that creates less violence is, of course, equality. Smaller gaps between all different groups, including class, gender, race, religion. We, through our education system directly, are turbocharging the inequalities between our kids, including with our very gendered schooling system, where our kids often don't even get to meet one another in the classroom, which I think is terrible and slowing us right down. But I did want to add, with the whole myth thing, and you used the word power a few times, and I think power is really important here, because women have been trained to be ashamed of being powerful. Men have been trained to be ashamed of being powerless. And so I often talk about women in power, and it took me a long time, because I'm a slow learner, to realise that all my books are basically about the same thing. They're about women taking back power, holding on to power, refusing to give up power. And when I talk to women about power, I often get this, oh no, we don't want power. Oh no, because they see power as always being used abusively. But of course, power just means agency. It really just means the power to do something. When you turn the power on, you usually get the stove to work or the lights go on. That's all it is. So I think women also have to stop, and stop being ashamed of seeking to have agency and control over their own lives and influence over other people's lives. That's just reasonable power in your own world. And in fact, when I wrote my first novel, which was a reimagining of Elizabeth I's life, Just a Girl, I was at a writers' festival, and there was all these school kids. It was the school kids' day, and there was a slip of a girl, I don't know, maybe she was only about 12 or even younger, in the front row, and she put her hand up and asked a question, and she said to me, when you were writing Just a Girl, which is about the young Elizabeth who was neglected, didn't have clothes that fitted her, had many wicked stepmothers, occasionally a nice one, she said, did you realise you were rewriting the Cinderella myth? And I looked at her and I said, oh my God, no, I didn't, but you're absolutely right. And you've now explained to me why when I was a kid in the 60s and I was looking for female role models, the only one I could find that I unequivocally could really hook on to, because all the others, Joan of Arc, people like that, they all died horrible deaths. But Elizabeth I died in her own bed of old age. Awesome. That's how we all want to go out. And she also held on to her power her whole life. And I said, you've just made me realise why I always admired her. In Cinderella, in all the fairy tales I was told as a kid, you had to wait as a woman for your prince to come and rescue you. But Elizabeth I, who famously refused to ever get married, became her own prince and rescued herself. And I think that's one of the most powerful stories. I'm not sure I told it as well as it could be told, but that idea of women hanging on to their own power inevitably means that men have to change their relationship with power if they want to remain in relationship with women. And perhaps that's why we're getting such a vicious and terrifying backlash.
I was about to say the backlash, like we are teaching women they can take up space, but I've been watching online hate for 10 years now, and the backlash against women when they are taking up space is extreme, and we've all personally experienced that, but there's data around that. I want to bring in Donald Trump here and JD Vance, because we've just all been reading this article in Wired, and what it's talking about is about, first of all, they've cast older women as the crazy cat lady. So they're bringing this witch trope right in and bringing it in
I find that really
strong.
offensive. I have dogs.
I just love that every single lady in the world with a cat is like cat ladies for Kamala.
And it's just forgot about Taylor Swift.
Yeah, it's backfired massively. But what is fascinating is that the Trump campaign is actually following these ancient tropes about masculinity and following the likes of Andrew Tate, the British American, isn't he, commentator.
He's British,
he's British something, he's got dual citizenship.
Born in America, lives in...
Yeah, he's British American, and he's very, very misogynist. And so the Trump campaign is spitting this stuff out, this manosphere stuff, and perpetrating it, and it really is taking hold. So I wonder if you could both reflect on that, given the sort of backstory we've just been talking about, because these are not new tropes, and they're now being amplified in a way that's frankly terrifying.
So I've spent the last year or so writing a book about the way we do sexual violence prevention education in classrooms, because I've been working in that area, and it's so... No, the full version of that. So that was the mini version, so the full proper book size version of that. It's just gone in, be published early next year. Anyway, there are a couple of things going on there. Firstly, I think it's dangerous to cast Andrew Tate as the only person doing this, which I don't think you were doing, but often we fall into the trap of using Andrew Tate as like a abbreviation for the manosphere. He's certainly the most prominent, but by no means is he the only one, and the thing I'm certainly seeing in classrooms now is, particularly amongst older senior school boys, is they'll roll their eyes. He's had his day, he's done now. They are still consuming this horrible content, but because the people around them go, oh, it's not Andrew Tate, so we're fine. We are not fine. The other thing about that content is that often, so Tate himself, and this is quite common, would present themselves as, oh no, I don't say misogynistic things. Drop the occasional thing, brush it aside as a joke, oh, that was 10 years ago, oh, you didn't understand the context, oh, I was joking, so that anybody trying to push back on it just doesn't understand and isn't really listening. But what he's doing is playing into that idea of the warrior myth, you know, that sitting there topless. And isn't it interesting that we talk about women being topless and men being shirtless? So I'm going to deliberately say he's sitting there topless, muscled, well-cut, well-dressed, well-presented, puffing on a cigar, talking about how powerful he is and how strong he is and how revolting men who are not those things are. He is absolutely playing up the warrior myth. The contempt for women is almost a sideline from that. Where that gets troubling is if you look at where he came from, which is the far right-wing nutjob area of the internet. That was where he got his start as a influencer. If you look back, I mean, I don't know, we can go back through Ernest Bax and back to Matthew Hale, who was the source of the, you know, it's easy to make a rape allegation and difficult to prove. And also he burned women at the stake for sentenced women to death for being witches. And was also the one who set the precedence to say that rape in marriage can't happen because a woman's given up her right to say no when she marries him. So that was he was 17 something or other, I think. So there is a very long history. The only difference with Andrew Tate, the only thing about him that makes him notable, more say than Milo Yiannopoulos, remember him from Gamergate? Tate is just another one in a very long line. The difference is that he happened at around the time that lockdown, just before we went into lockdown, was when he started to rise. It was the post-Me Too backlash of men going, oh, what do you mean? I can't even go to work and grab my co-workers on the arse. How is that fair? And what if somebody says that I raped her and I did and people will know about it? How is that fair? So in the response to all of that, in the absence of how to be a man that's not a warrior, and then we all went into lockdown, it was like a social experiment in hothousing the manosphere. And Tate rode that wave. I think he's probably on his way out now. It'll take a while because 10 million followers takes a long time to lose. But the thing that will happen next, with that amplification of social media, with that ability to reach into our boys' hearts as they sit at our kitchen table and break them without us even noticing, will not go away. That will get more. And you can see it, go into classrooms, there's two things that really stand out to me. One of them is the way boys who are performing this kind of, I'm such a big tough man and look at me pushing back on women and standing up for myself and doing all the things Tate says to do, is they're not looking at the girls in the classroom when they do it.
No, they're looking at the men.
They're looking at each other. Are you noticing what I'm doing? Are you approving of me? Are you giving me pats for being a proper good man? And then they all look at the other boys, and there are so many boys in those classrooms who are horrified by what is happening and feel powerless and helpless and sick about it. And then once the boys have all reassured each other of, yes, we all approve of each other and yes, you're being a proper man, they then turn on those boys and they punish them. Sometimes they punish them with violence, but they always punish them with shame. So all of these things are going on. The next Andrew Tate is out there somewhere right now. And he's waiting in the wings, and he will have to be that little bit more shocking and that little bit more horrible and that little bit more noticeable to replace Andrew Tate. And that terrifies me, but I know he's out there somewhere, and wherever you are, I
want to comment on the internet stuff in a minute because I spent 5 years embedded in those communities. But Jane, do you want to talk about the classroom stuff as well?
Well, I'm not in classrooms. I'm fighting for better, more equal classrooms, but I'm not actually in them. But I do, my daughter's she's trained to be a school counsellor. My sister is the principal of one of the most disadvantaged public schools in New South Wales. And they don't seem to be as concerned anecdotally about the boys being horrible and all that to women. They worry about the boys themselves being broken-hearted underneath all of that and actually very neglected in terms of parenting and building a kind of carapace to sort of protect themselves from what has been a fairly horrible world for a lot of them. My heart goes out to little boys and young men, but it isn't just in classrooms. When you were talking about the way the dynamics of in the classroom, the boys who are tough then punish the boys who step out from that paradigm and shame them. I remember when my husband was in corporate life, and he, unfortunately for him, though we are still married, nobody on the internet apparently understands how that could have happened. But it's...
What? A feminist that's married to a man? My God.
For 49 years. He, I've always been a feminist, and I never ironed his shirts. I never packed his bag. I assumed he was an adult with two hands and eyes to see, and that he was presumably capable of that extraordinary effort all on his own. And so it proved. And this was regarded by the men who worked with him as a form of betrayal. He was letting the side down. When they would see him in the hotel or where they were ironing his shirt for the morning, they would give him shit. Like they would pile shaming abuse on him. He didn't give, like really strong men, turn around and say, oh, fuck off, you pathetic losers. But that's hard, and it was hard for him too. But he got better at it over time because I wasn't ironing any fucking shirts no matter how ashamed he was. But what I'm saying is that is a dynamic that goes on for men in every age group. And that dynamic is self-defeating for them as well as for us.
The other thing I'd say about it also is I'm in early childhood centres, because we do early childhood work as well. I have seen this in 3-year-olds. And they did not come up with that themselves. That is absolutely learned behaviour.
My grandson gets shamed because he likes to paint his nails, and he's had to stop because at school they started to give him a really hard time. He used to go with his mum and get his nails done, and family tradition. And the male teacher stood up for him and said, oh, I love your nails, they're fabulous, which was great.
We'll talk about the different ways we need to start thinking about masculinity, but why the fuck do people iron things? I don't understand it. Like, it's like 30 seconds later you need to iron it again.
I'm terribly sorry, Ginger, but they look a lot fucking better when they're ironed.
Okay. Anyway, I want to go back to the internet for a second. You know, we often hear that the internet kind of created misogyny, like people say it's the internet. And the thing
is, that's not true.
That the first thing we need to understand is it's a societal problem. You know, it's been going for more than thousands of years, which is what Mary Beard was tracking. It didn't start online, but the internet proliferates it. So there's a place here, I'm always on about the platforms. The platforms are publishers, and if this kind of misogyny and rigid masculinity was, you read it in The Age or The Australian or you saw it on the ABC, they wouldn't be allowed. So basically we need regulation in terms of what, we need a duty of care to users for the platforms. That would actually, you know, stop a lot of the sort of radicalisation and the misogyny. The other thing I wanted to say was about the intervention points, Jane, because you're doing all this work with young kids, right? So I was embedded in white supremacist incel communities for 5 years, which led to my book Troll Hunting. And I was reading all this shit you're talking about, right? So loads and loads and loads of it, and many, many Andrew Tate-like figures, as you're saying. But one of the amazing things was when I really got to know some of these predator trolls, so these are extremists, misogynist extremists, incels, they all came from childhood neglect and violence, which will not surprise anyone in this room that's an advocate. So the one particular guy I got really close to ended up being my friend and is no longer a misogynist and is no longer a predator troll. But he hated women at that time. And he came from a really violent background. His mum had beat the shit out of him. She'd been an alcoholic. And then he went to live with Dad for a while. And Dad literally left him starving. Went on an interstate trip when he was 10. Pilot left him there. So this kid is alone online, reading the Andrew Tates of this world. And what do you know, turns out to be like a radicalised predator troll that does real life harm. This is the same kind of story that the Christchurch killer had, right? So the internet is a place of radicalisation where toxic and rigid masculinity thrives, and then we're all paying the price for that. Now, we're going to go to questions in a minute, so anyone who's got a question, we'll go to that in a second. But I want to talk about solutions. I know that we can all sit, you know, we could talk underwater, the three of us. Where do you think the solutions lie here? What can we actually do about this, apart from regulating the internet? Jane, C?
Well, I think we need to look very hard at the family court. This idea of sending children back to abusive husbands is not okay. If a man is violent in any way, he's not fit to be in the caring for children. I just think that should be, if anyone is violent, they're not fit to be caring for children. So the family court no longer has to do this thing where somehow a man can beat up his wife to a point where, you know, at all, and he's still, that has nothing to do with what he is as a parent. This splitting of men into husband and father, they're not split. They're still the same person. So I think the family court has to become a lot more proactive in terms of how they look at changing the trajectory of children's lives from violent relationships and setting an example in that. It's funny to talk to you about buying women's fiction, seeing women's films, but I think we should. And I think in schools, this excuse, well, we don't have any books where the girls are the protagonists because the boys won't read them, stop it. For the next 10 years, every book every child reads should have a girl as a protagonist, because we need to get men from a very early age to accept that women are just other human beings and that the differences are mostly minor. Men have residual nipples because they all started out as possible little girls. So, let's just get used to that and comfortable with that and not ashamed of that. So those are the things we can do from a very, very early stage. And I think the use of shame in parenting, full stop, has to stop. Shame is not a good parenting tool. It warps, it humiliates, and it crushes. And we just have to be much better and more thoughtful parents and grandparents than I think the generations before us had the time, the energy, or the knowledge to be. That's how we break the cycles of violence and misery and shame. So it's both systemic but also personal. And what I notice, even in very good men who I love, is that when they deal with children and they get in some way emotionally triggered, shame is the first place they go to. Why would you do that? Well, that's a shaming response. A child's done it because they have little impulse control, because it tempted them. So why would you do that? Is immediately saying to them, you're a little turd. You did a bad thing. Don't use that kind of language. And it's not hard. You just got to think. Schools too. Shame is not a management of children or anyone really tool. It breaks people. It doesn't build them.
I agree with that, but I think we need to do more to make that possible, because when I go into schools and when I talk to parents, a lot of the time what I'm seeing is people who desperately want to do the right thing. They're there because they care about children. They just don't know how. And when I think about how long it took me to understand all of this stuff, this is literally I do this like it's my job, because it is. And it took years to understand this, and it took a lot of work to understand this, and most parents, and certainly a lot of teachers, do not have that time. We have the most invested, motivated, engaged, on-the-spot frontline workforce in parents, particularly single mothers, but in parents and families generally. And like any workforce, they need the skills and the training and the work to be able to do their work properly, and we're not giving it to them. Like most workforces in Australia, it is highly gendered. So I'm sure all of us do lots and lots of public work, and we all write books, and I know that 95% of my audience are women. That men are not turning up, they're not learning. So when people like us, when all of the people I know who are doing the work to upskill that prevention workforce, men are not turning up. Yep. They think it's not their job. When you look at the research on why they don't turn up on, say, the skills to prevent child sexual abuse, which is absolutely about the adults, because children cannot prevent that. The adults around them have to do that work. Women are getting those skills, men are not. When we look at why, the two things that the research shows is that men say it's not their job, or they say they're afraid of being mistaken for a predator. So when we're doing the work that will change parenting ability and putting blame on parents for not being able to do a thing they've never been taught, I think is revolting.
That's shaming too, which
shaming
is helpful.
too. We need to put the work and the time and the money into giving parents those skills, ongoing support. We need to give teachers those skills and that knowledge. We need to do it across the board, and we need to make sure that men are involved. We need to require that men turn up in the way that those Nordic countries say, men, you have to take parental leave, go home and spend some fucking time with your child. We also have to say to men, turn up to these places and learn how to parent your child, because you are a parent. You are an uncle, you are a grandparent, you are a teacher, you are a sports coach. This is your job. Turn up and learn how to do it, because that's being a man.
But also, though, I mean, men often do feel isolated in these conversations. They feel defensive, and I understand why sometimes. So I guess the question is, how do we bring them with us?
Having been someone who was at the, part of the second wave of feminism, and being the only woman in the creative department and the only woman in the boardroom and the only woman at the conference, nobody ever said, women feel really isolated and alone in these, nobody ever did that. And we do infantilise men a lot, and in a way we enable them to plead, oh, but I'm scared. No, sorry, I get it, and I don't want to shame people for that, but at the same time, I want to say, you're not. You can stand it. You're strong, really strong, not muscly strong, and you can take a bit of criticism. You can manage that and live. We seem to bring up our boys to think that they're strong like this, but fragile as shit when it comes to a word of criticism.
Masculinity is fragile. I mean, we see that every time you say anything on the internet. You get fragile masculinity.
They're not fragile. You can do it. It's okay.
All right. I would love to we could talk about fragile masculinity. Are we out of time, or can we take any questions? No. Oh, that's a bit sad. Oh, well. I was all about the
questions later.
So, yeah, we'll be having coffee. Thank you for listening. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you to Ginger.
Yes, thank you, Jane and Ginger, for that absolutely awesome discussion on the panel. Unfortunately, yeah. Oh yes, there's some books also that Jane has got, and they'll be available outside. So you can approach Jane. And unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. There was one question on the app, and we won't be able to go through that. But you can catch Jane or Ginger outside and ask any questions you want. I also should have mentioned previously that please take the time to check out the bios of the panelists. They're all available on the app, and very impressive people on the panelists. And just as impressive and accomplished, distinguished, we've got the next session on what is accountability. How do we hold ourselves accountable as a sector? How do we hold governments to account? And discussion on systems, accountability. Thank you. And versus personal responsibility. I'd like to welcome our facilitator and panelists, Donna Chung, Damien Green, Professor Patrick O'Leary, Rodney Vlais, Tony Johansson, and Thelma Schwartz to the couch. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to the conference organisers for putting us after the journalists with great stories. Thank you for that. I was thinking, I just want to say two quick things before we get going, but I won't break into our time too much. One, I love a swearing woman, swearing sister. Thank you very much for being a swearer. I often get very judged for that, and obviously I'm not as smart as other professors because I swear. And the other thing that reminded me of is I used to watch Bewitched as a kid, and this is ageing us. I know only some of you will know what this means. I never understood why she gave up the power and why she wanted to do housework. What the? Anyway, then you know who I love though? Endora, and she is going to be my retired role model, the mother-in-law, which is the other evil woman is the mother-in-law. So thank you for that. It was a very enjoyable session. Okay, so just welcome the panel and thank you. And again, would echo our acknowledgements to the traditional owners of the unceded lands that we're living and working on, and thank Aboriginal people for their continuing, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks for their continuing generosity to share their culture and to be willing to engage with us and speak with us around what's happening and to learn from them, because I don't know if I'd be that generous, especially after the referendum, but that's me. I'm probably not a very generous person. Okay. My name's Donna Chung, and I'll just briefly ask other panel members. I work at Curtin University, and I have worked in family and domestic violence and sexual assault and feminist work for about close to 40 years now.
Hi, can you hear? I'm Patrick O'Leary. I work at Griffith University, and I've actually worked alongside Donna in a variety of ways of research and looking at men's behavioural change programs and general sort of integrated responses, really focusing on men who use violence.
Hi everyone. My name's Thelma Schwartz. I'm the Principal Legal Officer of the Queensland Indigenous Family Violence Service, QIFLS. I am a woman of many cultured backgrounds. My Torres Strait Islander heritage that I'm particularly proud of, and I note that I'm here in beautiful Naarm, and I pay my respect to elders who have loved and cared for this land for millennia. And I acknowledge that I live, work and play in beautiful Gimoy, which is Cairns in far north Queensland. and I acknowledge my Torres Strait Islander ancestry alongside my German, Samoan and Papua New Guinean heritage. And I was buoyed to follow very strong women. I come from a very strong line of women in both my matrilineal and patrilineal lines. My day job, obviously, is managing a legal practice. I've got over 25 years of practice experience as a criminal, as a lawyer. I've represented Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander men, women and children across all facets of the criminal defence system in Queensland, alongside my work as the Executive Officer, QIFLs. I'm heavily involved in law reform and policy reform at both state and national level, and I'm very pleased to be here on this panel talking to these issues. Thank you.
My name is Rodney. I was born on Wadjuk part of Noongar land, as I introduced before, and will add to that myself, my family, my communities who don't come from a First Nations context, we've got a lot further to go to understand our whiteness and what are the benefits that come with that whiteness and the suffering that this whiteness is built upon, and what can I learn about that whiteness to be different and more connected and more whole rather than so compartmentalised and separate. I've got a background in direct and indirect engagement with men who use domestic and family violence, gender-based violence in different ways, and I think I'm most passionate at the moment and over the last few years on supporting workforces, responders, communities that aren't part of specialist services, about how we do that direct and indirect work with those who use violence, because it's not going to be something that will be solved by specialist services alone.
My name's Tony Hansen. I'm at Family Life in the executive team there with Alison, our great CEO. I've been working in all sort of different manner of working with men who use family violence, whether that's in program management or design or facilitating men's behaviour change groups. I've also done a lot of psychotherapy with men who use family violence as well, and so I've got a multidimensional lens of it and a great passion for working with complex people who use family violence.
Thanks, Tony. So today we're going to talk about perpetrator accountability. So I just wanted to talk for a couple of minutes in terms of the background to it. So I guess one of the things why it continues to be important is it's kind of the bedrock that we put the national policy on. It's the secondary kind of goal after women's and children's safety. So it's talked about, it's described all of the time, but when we ask it about being operationalised, it's not really written about, it's not really defined well, and we don't operationalise it particularly well. So, you know, there's been little definition and little kind of articulation of what it might look like, and so it's kind of collapsed or become synonymous with the criminal justice response. So being held accountable is often reduced to being hauled in front of the courts or being, you know, justice involved, as we would describe it. The other kind of, I guess, partner to that is responsibility is the other issue that's often raised in terms of, has also been the other issue. That's a much more individualised kind of way of thinking about how we work with perpetrators, and has often been synonymous with men in behaviour change programs acknowledging their use of violence at a very kind of superficial level has sort of been how that's often been operationalised, or, you know, some of the critiques of responsibility being like a confessional where you acknowledge what you've done and you open your heart to make change, etc. So we've had this structural problem with gender inequality and violence against women and girls, but what we've often had is a very individualised response to individual men. So some of that's being addressed now with more prevention type of processes, programs, etc., which is good, but we've still got this dilemma of a social problem with individual men coming into programs. So I think it's a really good time, given especially the name of the conference around leading radical change, to start to think about how do we work with those who we know are using violence and abuse. So there's some, you know, discussion to be had that I want to kind of pick up the panel around that. And I guess at the level of government legislation and policy, Government systems aren't always aligned with perpetrator accountability. So in fact, the example that Jane gave of the family court in the previous session shows us that whilst everybody wants to stop violence against women and children, over here in the family court, here's the rules around being a parent. And often the example I think of is it's one of the few situations where we force another human being to be in contact with another human being. So my example is always, this guy's been in prison, he's committed rape, so he's getting out of prison, he hasn't got anywhere to live. Can this rapist come and live in your spare room? Of course he can't. I'm not having some rapist living in my house. Yeah, but he hasn't raped you. He's raped someone else. So why can't he live in your spare room? So for me, that's analogous to what we do to children in the family court. It doesn't matter whether you think he has or hasn't battered that child. That child knows that that person is capable of that violence and that abuse. So to leave them in a situation where they are frightened and scared is because they're children and because of the men's rights, male adult rights, trumping children's rights and children's autonomy in those situations. So for me, that's the big issue with that. So in many situations, what we end up with is both a survivor and a person causing harm feeling a massive sense of injustice, but for very different reasons. And so I think we need to sort of acknowledge and speak about that really deep felt injustice that people feel that this happened to them. Even if there's self-blame and all of that might be happening for survivors, there is still a very strong sense of injustice for folks. I think the other thing to keep in mind with this is that we only ever see a tiny percentage of all of the people who are causing harm and using family and domestic violence who are sexually assaulting folks. We see a tiny smidge, and it's easy to think that we're seeing the whole population when we're just seeing a tiny slice. So, those coercive, controlling people who are never going to come to the attention of justice systems. They're never going to come into counselling because there's never anything wrong with them. So I think it's really important to remember that when we do research and we work with people, they are a small smidge of the totality, and there's a lot of people missing and invisible in that process. So at the tertiary level, we kind of have long-standing approaches and programs, and we have I think long-standing orthodoxies about how we respond. Civil like police call-outs, civil law restraining orders, court responses in and into programs. So it's that's been the stock standard way. And what we've done is tweak it, but we've never really, we haven't changed the road. We've just sort of added a lane or, it stayed pretty much in place as is. We haven't had a lot of change. So that's what I want to come to today. And if I can just ask, moving from Patrick as a researcher and former MP through to folks that are working in direct practice, what do you think needs to be held or continued? What do we need to keep within the perpetrator intervention system, as it's often called? What are the really important foundational aspects?
Well, within that broader system, and I think picking up even on the previous presentation about shame and blame, and often men can't. Their first presentation to the perpetrator system is not as I've used violence, but more as their own feeling of injustice or blame and shame about how they've got there. So we don't have good systems to actually build accountability, and often accountability within the perpetrator system is used as a stick. So what we need to stop that, and we need to go more to how does the system actually manage his journey to the perpetrator system that actually supports and reframes it away from blame and shame game towards empowerment and also his own sense of benefit from it. Because often the accountability structures we often put in the formal system aren't very attractive to him. So how do we make it more attractive to him so he picks it up?
I think on that's quite difficult for me. Obviously, working as a criminal defence lawyer for close to 10 years, when I look at it across the Northern Territory and Queensland, defending men who have and I'm using very specific gendered language because that was the gender they chose when I represented Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and boys in watch houses, and I have sat in too many watch houses to want to remember and recall, including prison cells in jails. Now, what struck me at all times was a great sense of, I've done nothing wrong, miss. It's her fault. There was no accountability for the conduct because in their view and their mind, and when I look back at my own childhood history growing up in a violent household with my dad, I can do what I please. And when we only use the criminal justice system as the lone silver bullet to address these behaviours, you're not going to hold someone to account. In what we need to see right at the heart is acknowledging, you know what, I'm a shit human being and I am a swearer. Sorry, I'm going to own it. What I've done is wrong. Where I've come from is a wrong place. But I also acknowledge with some of the men and boys that I represented, and this is really important when you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the language we use specifically, we don't speak in the individual language of just victims or domestic violence. We speak broadly about family violence. Because in our households, those men have experienced and witnessed violence in all its plethora of forms. So what are we doing to support, address the harm and trauma those little children have experienced? And the only response we get from the system is probably one of the most traumatic I see. And that is, we will support mum to get an order. We won't necessarily see the impact on her children. They'll be named in Queensland as a related party. Okay, all right, so they're to the side. But because mum's been brave enough to raise domestic and family violence, that's a mandatory notification to Child Protection Services, who come in and then demonise and weaponise the system against our mums, and they take our babies. And I know, and you can go and research the Family Matters report produced by Snake from 2023, there is a high percentage of our children under 1 removed. And in Queensland, we're waiting a minimum of 6 months to get a bloody case plan from Child Safety. And I'm frustrated because of these blockages. And they are set up to break the connection between mother and child, those natural bonds. How is she meant to bond with her baby? And then what we see is that flow-on effect, because we can get so caught up in just seeing as a singular violence, just here. But what happens when you take that child? That child comes into the system. They then will never reunify with their parents or cultural connections. We put them in the system, in the child protection system. They will then eventually graduate into the youth justice system. They're known in the literature as our crossover kids. And because of what they've been institutionalised within the system, they will then go on to graduate to adult offenders. And around this merry-go-round we go. No matter how many reports this country can have, we're not doing anything to address the underlying reasons for the appalling overrepresentation of our children. We're not getting to the heart of violence within our communities. We're airbrushing. And you know what? I'm sick and tired of airbrushing because we're getting nowhere. And the fact that we talk about one woman being killed in this country every day should be the rocket up everyone's backside in government to shift, because it is not good enough. We shouldn't be having to educate our girls on this is how you have to be safe, how we protect you. My God, this is 2024, and I know I'm talking to the converted here, but you can hear the sense of frustration. We can't. This cannot go. I'm sorry.
should not need to apologise at all, Thelma, for rage and anger
I think it's because that's how we're being brought up as women, that we always need to apologise from that feminist perspective. What is a good woman? We need to be silent. You know, it's that ideal victim construct.
Yeah, which is a very passive feminine one. Yeah. That's correct.
Yes, in Victoria there are more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children removed now than there was during the stolen generation. And if we think of, and I'll come back to it's all related to the question, but if we think when we're working with someone who's causing harm, a man who's using violence, who can have a variety of different intents behind that. Sometimes the intent is absolutely ugly, sometimes the intent is not so ugly, but it's the impacts that count. It's the impacts, the harm that's done, irrespective of the intent of the person who's caused harm, although the intent matters for our risk assessments. More Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children removed now compared to the stolen generation does not matter about the intent of the system. The impacts are even worse now than before. So there is violence, structural violence that is happening at a scale which is not less than what it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think just really, really briefly, a lot of accountability now is about mechanisms. It's about mechanisms from criminal justice system or child protection or other institutions where if the mechanism is enacted, if the intervention order or the ADVO is given, if the user of violence is charged, if he goes to a program, tick, he's being held accountable. And accountability is seen as holding him accountable just by mere virtue of that mechanism. Whereas, as we know, for many of the men, particularly for men who from oppressed and marginalised communities, but not just, they're in huge victim stance. Already it's part of the green light that they give themselves to use violence, as we all know. As you were saying, Thelma and Patrick, she did this to me. So they're already in big victim stance to cope with their shame, to be able to make use of their male entitlement and privilege. They're shouldered up, supported in a patriarchal society to make choices to cause harm. So then these mechanisms, which to an extent might be needed to manage risk when we don't have other community responses or when those community responses have been colonised, oppressed, destroyed, then we rely on those justice system mechanisms to try to build some safety for victim survivors. But that sends them further into victim stance. And because the numbers are massive, even though it's only a small proportion, as you're saying, Donna, there's not the funding, there's not the resources to be able to then have conversations with him around helping him to have some different meaning out of the responses to him. And particularly in those states and territories, such as the Northern Territory, where there's still no needs-based funding and still funding on a tiny population basis, there is hardly anyone to be able to have these conversations with those who cause harm. And so when he continues to make harmful choices and he's shouldered up, supported to make those choices to cause harm, whether they be in the heat of the moment or whether he's making choices very, very upstream, planning them, putting lots of effort into those choices to control her and her family, the mechanisms are seen as holding him accountable rather than how do we build that accountability in a way that's meaningful for him, for his community, and to open up channels for him at the rate that he can to see the harm that he's causing and to be accountable to those harms.
Thanks, Rodney.
I see the web of accountability, I think is how we refer to it in Victoria, and then the concept of personal responsibility. I see them as both essential pieces to the puzzle here, and I understand the accountability framework and the web of accountability. I think the way we're articulating it, like cops and courts and some extras, is how I understand it. And I think where we're struggling to make gains in the desistance of men's use of violence against women and children is when they hit our service system. When the accountability system brings them to the door, and then we open the door, and then we have various different ways of engaging him beyond that point. And there's an expectation, I think, from our funders that the accountability system continues through the service stream. And when you see that play out in action, you see a lot of seat warming going on at best until men's orders are finalised or until they do or don't get access to children. And that will be the determination as to whether they engage or don't engage in treatment. And so, for me, I have a firm belief that the accountability the accountability system brings him to our door as service providers. There's a line in the sand, and we say, if you step through this door, we're encouraging you to take personal responsibility for the way you behave, not just in the past, but now going forward, and for the impacts of those behaviours on other people, in a very invitational, engaging way. And if he accepts that invitation, he can then go on his journey of taking responsibility for the way he moves through the world and the repercussions and impacts of his behaviour. And if he decides to reject that invitation, then that's his choice as a sovereign agent. But I'll put him back into the accountability system, and some courts can deal with him, and they'll bring him back to the door, and we'll have the same conversation again. And I think the reason our treatment isn't quite as effective as it could be is because we're expected to continue that sort of very punitive accountability framework well into treatment that actually needs a lot more trauma-capable sort of idiosyncratic understanding of the individual sitting in front of us. And so I'm very passionate about the accountability system doing a whole lot more, and for treatment providers feeling free to provide treatment and not having to play this quasi-policing role. I think that's currently where the tension is for me.
And I think for me what sort of sits up with this work a lot is, as a kind of a social worker trained in the 80s, often with when we would work in corrections or probation and parole, as it was then, people would say, well, the client isn't the person in front of you, the client's the court, because the court's ordered you to see this person. And I think that's one of the issues that happens with men's behaviour, working with people causing harm, is that often the client are the women. For me, if you use that language of the client is the woman and children, who a lot of workers may never even get to see or speak to or really understand what they're doing. So I feel like you're always working with one hand behind your back in this space as well. But often I think for people that are new to the work, they see the person sitting directly in front of them as the client in that way, you know, rather than the broader system, which is slightly different for Thelma working with men using violence, you know, as a legal rep as well. So
I think, Donna, you've probably picked on one of the biggest tensions that currently exists within the system, particularly within the criminal justice system, which is held as the accountability mechanism, and that is the lack of standing of a victim in their own proceedings. It is about her, without her. The focus is always upon the defendant, and the tension that exists in our rule of law, that the defendant is entitled to a fair hearing, that the defendant is entitled to trial before their peers, their jury. But what about the rights of a victim survivor to live a life of dignity, to live a life free from violence and harm? That is not embedded within our rule of law, that is recognised within the criminal justice system, and we struggle within it. And this, for me, has been one of the key tensions in building the system to recognise her space. And I think Patrick and I have both worked on the task force in Queensland, and it was aptly titled, Hear Her Voice. Yeah. But I think we should have gone one step further and actually say, well, see her. She's here. Yeah. Don't treat her as an add-on. You're penalising him, but when are you actually going to get him to see the impact of his actions, his behaviours, on not only her, but the children? Because those kiddies are always present. They may not see it, but they will hear it. And that has an ongoing, everlasting impact.
Absolutely, and thanks for that. I think it's a really important point in that discussion about it. And I think, you know, and this is the tension of the criminalisation approach, where we rely on a white, Western, colonial, patriarchal justice system. Like the justice, we've kind of had to rely on this system as if it's a neutral system that can be reformed and can be changed. But the enshrined principles of it mean that it's really kind of for you to defend yourself. It's not for me to show the harm that that's been impacted on me. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, gentlemen, I saw in women's testimony of how the criminal justice system in going against the person using violence also punished the women and children through its outcomes, through its assumptions about people's backgrounds, etc.
Absolutely. And, you know, the fining of people for breaching intervention orders, restraining orders. That's an excellent strategy with people that haven't got a lot of money. And it's an excellent strategy when people can be vengeful, isn't it? You know, like we know what's going to happen with that. So not only do you feel like you're worth, you know, what happened to you is only worth a fine. So not only are you sort of dehumanised in that way, but also it's going to create, you know, waves after that as well in terms of the repercussions. So I think, yeah, we're in that real juxtaposition with it, as in it's, yeah, keep it, like, how much do we keep, it's a bit like how much do you keep adding on to the house? How many en-suites and back rooms can you put on to something that's fallen down at the front? Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes, so I was just going to ask people for any final comment or final word they might have.
I think I'd like to touch on, from a cultural perspective, following on from the really insightful conversation that we had at the beginning, shame and culture. Now, I think it's really important not to just apply a broad brush with respect, because shame is a useful tool within culture. What we see, though, is a real lack of support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations-led initiatives with elders, with people who use violence. So I think that's really important to understand, that there is a shame element built in within our culture, and we've used that to hold people to account. And this is some of the reforms that we are trying to do under the National Partnership Agreement on closing the gap, and those priorities and targets that sit underneath it. So it's important to recognise and allow the room for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples into this space to speak for ourselves. With respect, we can speak for ourselves, we can stand up, and we will call it out. I don't care what happened in that voice referendum. That was a sad, sorry indictment on this country. But we are here, we will continue to be here, and we will continue to advocate for our space in this country, our country and yours.
I think one of the challenges in some of the work I've been recently involved in is that the complexity of accountability, particularly how we like to have binary positions of victim perpetrator within our system. And I think of how the accountability of systems where they've failed children and failed boys, where we have boys coming to, you know, that you're representing, who the system has fundamentally failed through adverse child experience, through missing things, the effect of that trauma on that ongoing level of, you know, pathway towards violence. And so the system that pays us, the system that's part of our livelihoods, we have an accountability, don't we? Because we miss things. We still benefit from the system and the funding, but we also have to change it within. And so that accountability, letting people down, I mean, we like it to be neat, but it's never neat.
I think a number of things are coming up for me, including just hearing from you, Thelma, around what do myself as a white person need to think about my narrow lens around shame, because that's cultural safety. I've got a particular view of shame, and I want to learn more about shame in other cultures and contexts. That's critical. I think, really briefly, when I started out in this, it was like, oh, men's behaviour change program work, oh, it's so pure, it's such hard work, can only be done by those super uber professionals that meet the minimum standards to the max, and don't dare anybody else try to do this. Yeah, you know, I was young and green back then. But I think now we've got to take this work out everywhere. And of course, we can't make men's behaviour change program practitioners out of AOD counsellors or youth workers or family support workers or housing workers or elders. But when the men have such strong victim stance, when we have a delicate weaving of entitlement, male entitlement, men being shouldered up to cause harm in every culture, trauma, and for some communities, institutionalised structural systemic violence. And as a result of that, the victim standard grows even more. A lot of us need skills, not just us in programs, but others, how to have conversations that help some healing, help him to make different meaning out of responses. It can't just be left to the pointy end programs, and we've got decades of work to do to support those community responses and responses by a range of workforces of how we hold entitlement, patriarchy, trauma, structural violence all together in a way that doesn't make excuses for him, doesn't insult him, but also acknowledges that we have to build safety quickly while going slowly because of the underlying shame.
Yeah, and I think from an accountability standpoint, I think we've got to stop holding largely a workforce of social workers and therapists and counsellors, who are largely female, accountable for not holding him accountable for his use of violence. I just think it's insane, right? There's a system of accountability out there, and it should be ramped up, and then you bring him to us treatment providers. It's not our job to do that, it's our job to help him heal and stop him using violence.
Thanks, Tony. And I think that's a really good point about system accountability rather than who gets to be face-to-face in the room with the people. Yeah, and I think that's what's often missing. And particularly, people will say, all these people have got experiences of trauma and violence in their background. But a lot of that is state intervention. It is I'll remove you from your home, I'll put you in foster care, you won't fit in well, and then you'll run away, etc. You'll start offending, we're going to kick you out at 18, sorry, no, we'll extend it to 21 now, it's okay. It's not psychological, it's structured into our system. Can I just thank the amazing panel for their very generous contributions today. I was a bit scared of this panel, but it's gone well, about how we were going to manage, especially managing the time. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Donna. Thank you, Professor Patrick. Thank you, Thelma, Tony, and Rodney, for that awesome presentation. Our next session, which will take us to lunch, is a pre-recorded one. It's on radical leadership. We've been talking about engaging men for 30 years. It's time to mobilize men. And that is going to be facilitated by Jackson Katz, Mentors in Violence Prevention, in conversation with Lizette Twistleton of No to Violence. While we're waiting for the recording, can I have your attention, please? Thank you. While we're waiting for the recording to start, just a reminder that there's a silent auction which is now open and will close at 4:30 p.m. So please place your bid before the end of afternoon tea, before 4:30. Thank you very much.
It's so good to be sitting here having a conversation, about to have a conversation with you, Jackson. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm. I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present. And for me, as a guest in this country for 38 years or so, I always feel it's such an honour and a privilege to live on country that's been loved, cared and nurtured for over 60,000 years. This is Reconciliation Week, when we're filming this, a really important time for us in Australia to be supporting reconciliation for us on the harms that have happened here in Australia since colonisation. We're here to have a conversation about the work that's been done and the work ahead of us to end men's violence against women. And I'm really interested in hearing some of your thoughts. We have a few questions to ask, but I'm really happy to have a conversation.
Thank you. I look forward to the conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation and dialogue, especially at this time in the Australian sort of cultural and political history around this subject matter. It's a time of intense I think reflection and calls to action. And so timing is right, and I'm very happy to be part of the conversation. So thank you.
Fabulous. You've been in this work for a long time, and very recognised for your, particularly from your early work all the way through around championing men to kind of really do something about men's violence, but and to kind of really put it in the fact that this is kind of men's business too, importantly. Can you talk to me a little bit about kind of what got you into the work and sort of some of the history? Just to contextualise it.
Sure. So I started engaging with these ideas when I was a 19-year-old, university student back a long time ago. And one event, there's many different reasons why people end up being drawn to, whether it's social activism or on various issues. But one thing I did note early on was I used to live in a co-ed residence hall when I was a university student, and I was enjoying my freedom to come and go at all hours of the night, which white men of my generation, and not just my generation, often have that kind of freedom to not worry about our personal safety. And I'm not saying it's necessarily thoughtful or rational, but it's pretty normative. Anyhow, I was enjoying myself quite a lot, living away from home and at this big university, and I would come home 3 to 4 in the morning. But I lived in a residence hall that was co-ed, and so I had women on both sides and across the hall, and they had a completely different experience of safety and mobility and freedom. And I remember thinking, because they were always worried about how they're going to get home, and it was, especially at night, it's like a concern about their safety, and their safety was vis-a-vis men. In other words, they were worried about being abducted or assaulted by men. And I remember thinking, if I were a woman and I had to live like that on a daily basis, I'd be so ticked off about it. And then when I saw women organizing, feminist organizing against violence against women, and then for better lighting on campus, things like that, I remember thinking, not that these women hated men, but that they were standing up for themselves, and not just themselves, but anybody who has the right to walk across campus or go home and not, walk home at night and not worry about being assaulted. And I remember being inspired by that. And that was the beginning of my journey of thinking about, like, for example, as a man, how would I feel if I were a woman living in a misogynist society with all this violence by men? Or how would I was at the same time as I was thinking about as a white person, I was really engaging with issues of racism more than I had, frankly, when I was younger, and issues of racial justice. And then I also happen to be heterosexual, so I was thinking about, because this was the beginning of really the intense beginning of what you used to call the gay rights movement, or the gay and lesbian movements, but the LGBTQ movements. And again, I was taking all of this in at the same time, and I was thinking, as a man and as a white man and as heterosexual white man, I occupy certain positions of advantage. And I remember thinking, where are the men? Why aren't there more men speaking out about this, like about domestic and sexual violence? Men are committing the overwhelming majority of the violence. Men have the most of the power in the world, in the society. Why is it a women's issue? Why like, even the act of calling domestic and sexual violence a women's issue is what I consider a subtle form of victim blaming. Like, it's women's problem. It's something that happens to women. Women need to address it. Women need to deal with it. I didn't have exactly the language back when I was 19 to articulate it in the way that I just did, but I got the sense that we need more men speaking out. And because I was pretty confident as a young man, and I was a really good, American football player, and I was accomplished, and so I had a platform because people were interested in hearing what I had to say. When I started writing about this, I was a student journalist, and I started writing about this, and people would come to me, and women around me would share stories with me about their experiences. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is like a much bigger problem in the world than I had ever been aware. And I also, finally, because I was interested in all these other issues, whether it's racism or colonialism or the decolonizing moment of the mid-20th, late 20th century, and there was so many big picture things happening in the gay rights movement, and obviously anti-racism. I started understanding that domestic and sexual violence and men's violence against women and gender violence, but also gender equality. These were like marbled into every other issue that I was concerned with as a young man. And I got early on that as a man, if I were to speak out on these matters, if I were to use my, voice or whatever, whatever way, in whatever way I could actually contribute to something really meaningful. And it wasn't about a direct experience that I had in my life or a woman had, although subsequently I started becoming aware of how much domestic and sexual violence were around me, including in my family and friendship networks. I wasn't quite aware of that at the moment, but I did get that this was much bigger than some people think, and so I was excited to be part of it. And from the beginning, I knew that a missing piece in the social transformation was men and men's leadership. And obviously, women's leadership was incredible and has always been the front edge of all the transformative change. But it's not enough, and there's all these men, and that's what been my
Invisible
passion.
men.
Yeah.
Invisible men.
Yeah.
And we know through the work when we're working with men that generally, they remain fairly invisible within the system, within people knowing exactly what they're doing in their own homes. You've seen a lot of change, I'm sure, since those early days. Unfortunately, we seem to be in a time at the moment where we're seeing an erosion of those rights across the world. And particularly, when we have such dominant kind of voices, really misogynistic voices that are leading so much of the harm that's come back again with force, where, I feel really concerned about it. I feel concerned about our future, and I know that those rights that have been gained through the civil rights movement, through the LGBTIQ plus movements, through women's advocacy, is starting to be eroded. Human rights for women, girls, queer people, people of colour, marginalised people generally, is really going backwards. What are some of your thoughts around that? Because there's some pretty obnoxious voices in that space.
Yes, and I'm an American, and this is an election year, and the leading candidate for the right now leading in the polls, and the presumptive Republican nominee for president is on trial in Manhattan for a case relating to the way that he has treated women his whole life.
Yep.
It's just unbelievable, right? But I do think. I think the measure of the backlash and the extent of the backlash globally is a measure of how far we've come and how much progress women have made and LGBTQ folks have made. Because let's be honest, if we're talking about in historical terms, there has been incredible transformative change over the last several decades. When you think about the thousands of years of patriarchal history and what's changed in the last 50 years, it's pretty dramatic. Now, I know that I have many friends, including many women friends, who are like, it's not fast enough, it's not happening fast enough, and I appreciate that, but I think if you take a step back for a moment, you can see that the change has been dramatic. And every time we progress as human societies, there's going to be forces at work that are trying to block the progress and then trying to go back to before the progress. And I think this is what's happening. I think men all over the world. And by the way, one of the narratives that doesn't get, well, let me frame it this way, both in Europe and the United States, and perhaps as well in Australia. I don't know as much about Australia in this context as I do about Europe and the United States. But much of the narrative about the backlash against social progress has to do with race and racism and immigration and the increasing racial and ethnic diversification of these countries, including my own country. And I appreciate that's one of the big ones. That is clearly one of the big ones. But what often gets left out of that conversation is that there's an awful lot of men who are fighting back against women's progress, against feminist advancement, and heteronormative people, especially men, fighting back against the LGBTQ challenge to heteronormative centrality. And people often just either don't even mention that, or they just put it as like a marginal force. And I don't think it's marginal. For example, I think Trumpism, a big part of Trumpism is men who are really frustrated and resentful that they've lost authority within the family and within the larger society. And by the way, many of them have seen Donald Trump, however crude he is, as a vehicle for getting men's power back, and through the laws and through institutional practice and political and policy decisions, giving power back to men vis-a-vis women. And it's not just about race. You have to marble it in. It has to be intersectional, which means you have to include gender whenever you talk about race, just like you have to always include race when you talk about gender. Because if you don't talk about them, and also, you know, the LGBTQ forces, because if you don't marble all these analyses together, you're missing an incredibly important piece of it. But can I also say, when I came over here for this trip, I've been here for, you know, this is my second week in country. One of the first things we did in Perth with my hosts over at Communicare, White Ribbon, we did a yarning circle for Aboriginal elders, and it was women and men, and there were more men than women, and many of the women were really noting and kind of moved by the fact that there were more men than women, and the focus was on domestic and sexual violence in Aboriginal Australia. And I think that was very hopeful. And I think one of the things that those women were saying, they were essentially, and I can't speak for them, but I was part of the yarning circle. I think what I was hearing was they want the men to step up. They want the men to do more. They want the men to be leaders on this subject, and that they've carried too much of the burden too long. And so one of the things that I said, and one of the reasons why we planned this event at the beginning of my 2-week trip here in Australia, which includes my visit here in Melbourne and then a couple of days in Canberra, and I have some audiences of some powerful people, including some powerful white men. And I said, I want to be able to, Jackson, want to be able to bring to those groups of powerful men the idea that I got some input from these Aboriginal leaders who are saying we need more Aboriginal men at the table, at the decision-making table, around what needs to happen going forward. And the white sort of majority or the dominant culture in some ways needs to facilitate that, both financially supporting it, but also other structural supports. Not that the dominant culture needs to tell the Aboriginal people what they need to do, but they need to facilitate them to do it. But in particular, the presence of Aboriginal men in that process is critical. And I think that's great. I think that's one of the ways you use social privilege.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I work with a group of Aboriginal male leaders in New South Wales, and they're representative of many communities across Australia, across New South Wales. And it's really such a wonderful, for me, experience to be working alongside Aboriginal men wwho are stepping into that place. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. And in many ways, I think some of the leadership that's really coming through in this country is from First Nations people across Australia. Mm-hmm. They are kind of talking about, you know, trauma-informed practices. They're talking about, we don't want our men going to jail. We just want the violence to stop. And we know that needs to start with men engaging in a whole range of processes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think there are men who are ready to do that.
Right.
And I think what part of why I'm here in Australia this couple of weeks is to help catalyze some of that and to share ideas about what I and others have been doing in this space, but in other countries, including obviously in my own country, and helping to sort of reframe a certain narrative. I mean, the narrative that still people have to this day about the domestic and sexual violence, and it's fundamentally a women's issue,
right.
And we need some more good men to help out. Yeah. And I've been, kind of beating this drum for 35 years. It's like, it's a men's issue. It's like, if men aren't involved, we're not doing prevention. Yes, women's leadership has been, again, I think it's important that men say this, women's leadership has been utterly world historical in its transformative impact. And by the way, men and boys have benefited dramatically from women's leadership. This is another thing that men need to say out loud. It's not just women and girls who have benefited from the advocacy of women in this space, it's men and boys. And by the way, some of the first people to talk about and to speak about the experience of boys traumatized by what their father, their stepfather, their mother's boyfriend does to their mother. In other words, all the boys growing up in homes who are so-called, witnesses to domestic violence, a term that I don't like, because they're victims, they're not witnesses, right? They're not observing something happening to somebody else. They're experiencing it happening to themselves. That's right. The women in the domestic and sexual violence field have been the ones since the 1970s who have been allied with those boys, not just the girls, but the boys, and yet they often get called, and you know this better than I do, but they often get called, the anti-male, or they're bashing men, this is all ignorance. And I think men really need, especially those of us who have a platform, really need to say this stuff out loud, and partly because it takes the pressure off of women. In other words, it's unfair that women get criticized for just saying the violence needs to stop, and kids deserve to grow up at home free from abuse. Kids, including boys, girls, and others, they have a flat-out right to grow up free from abuse, and we're failing them if we're giving them that, if that's their experience, we're failing them. Not just individual families. I think these are societal problems, right? But when men say these things, sometimes we can be heard by other men in a way that women can't. And I do think I don't think that's fair, but I think it's the way the world works. And I also think that a lot of men are ready to do this. I think a lot of men are unsure of what to do. And so my experience over the last couple of weeks, certainly here, but also in my work more generally, is I work with a lot of men who are good men, but they really don't know what to do. They don't know what to say, and they often default to doing nothing or keeping their head down and pretending it's not really, a big problem.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're bad people. I just think they need a push, they need ideas, they need support, and we need to change the conversation.
Yeah. And so, what do you, in your experience, in your work across the world, what are you seeing that's really cutting through on some of that, around engaging with men and supporting them to have that both insight and language and the vulnerability and courage together to be able to speak out and to be able to be those.
Well, a couple things. Thank you. A couple things. One is I use the term engaging and mobilizing men because engaging is too passive as far as I'm concerned. Engaging is good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's a good thing. But when I hear the word engaging, I think of engaging in a conversation. We've been engaging in conversations with men for 50 years about this subject. That's not enough. It doesn't meet the moment. And I think saying engaging and mobilizing is more active. And when I say mobilizing, I think there are an awful lot of men here in Australia, as well as in my country and all over the world, really. And I do think there's an awful lot of men who do know the status quo is wrong, is unsustainable. They are outraged by these incidents that they keep hearing about, whether it's domestic homicides or sexual assault, or the pervasiveness of sexual harassment on the streets, or the misogynist manosphere and the social media universe where so many young women don't even go to certain places in digital universe because of the misogyny, especially if they speak out in support of themselves or women's rights, and the torrent of abuse that they can get. It's not just about the extreme cases of domestic homicide. There's misogyny is much deeper.
Every day.
And every day, that's right. I think a lot of men know this. They've been listening to women. They've been hearing from women around them. Or they don't even just have to hear from women around them. They just have to open their eyes. It's not that complicated. So I don't think that we have to start from scratch in terms of these men don't know what's going on. I think a lot of men do. But I think the next step is the key step. That's why I use the word mobilize, because we have to take some of those men's energy and their consciousness and push them to do more. I would say that the game changer, this is my analysis, the game changer, and we're not there yet anywhere in the world, is to understand these issues as leadership issues for men, not just as men's issues. And when I say leadership issues for men, leadership can be both informal and formal. But when I'm saying formal leadership, it means that if you're a man in a position of institutional leadership, you're a principal of a high school, you're a coach of a team, you're a CEO, you're a manager, you're a director, you could be a teacher, you could be a father or an uncle, or you could be a religious, Sunday school teacher. There's a million examples of men who are in positions of leadership within some institutional framework. I think the men in those positions, and everybody, but I'm focusing on the men, need to take seriously that they're in a position of leadership and that we expect them as leaders to speak about this subject matter, to be somewhat knowledgeable, not to be an expert, because that's an unfair and unrealistic expectation, but to be able to support victims and survivors, to be able to challenge and interrupt abuse. But the overarching responsibility of a leader is to create and sustain a climate in their domain within which abusive behavior is seen as completely socially unacceptable, and contrary to the values of the group. The leader is the person most responsible for setting that tone and following through on it. Everybody has a responsibility, but the leader has the most responsibility. And by the way, this is directly analogous to what's in the military called command climate. So in the military, everybody has a responsibility for their own behavior, and everybody has a responsibility to the chain of command, especially those beneath them in the chain of command. But the commander has a responsibility for setting the tone for the entire organization. That's what command climate means. And I would say the analog in civilian world, which is where I do most of my work, although I do work with the military, most of the work I do and my colleagues do is in the civilian world. It is, again, the principal, the teacher, the coach, the CEO, the manager, the director. You have all these men are in those positions all over the world who have no idea how to be leaders on this subject. And so what they end up doing is they end up deferring to women or delegating authority to women. Oh, Lizette knows all about that. We're going to give her the responsibility. Ms. Smith she knows about domestic violence and sexual harassment issues, and she's a good person on this issue. And by the way, what message does that send? It sends it's a women's issue. Yeah. And especially to the men and the young men, it just reinforces the idea this is really women's concern. I'm a guy, I'm a male leader, but it's not really my thing. This has got to change. Because imagine if we held men in positions of leadership to the standard that you have to be conversant, you have to be somewhat knowledgeable, and you have to use your position in this way. To me, this is a game changer.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of men, it's also positive and aspirational, because you're not pointing your finger and saying, we're calling out your bad behavior, your toxic behavior. We're saying we need men to step up. We need men to be leaders and strong and by the way, it can't be optional. That's the other thing. Mm-hmm. The model that people have been operating on for decades now is women do all this hard work, and then they ask men to support that work. They ask men to show up at this conference or write a check to support this event or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the men can either say yes or they can say no. Mm-hmm. This is not a sustainable model.
No.
If you changed it and flipped the script a little bit and said, this isn't just about nice guys helping out the women. This is a responsibility of leaders, and we're going to build it into job descriptions. We're going to build it into funding streams. We're going to say that we expect leaders at all levels to have knowledge and act on these matters. Guess what? All these men who would never voluntarily walk through the door to go to a training or to take a course or read a book, and in other words, to expand their knowledge on this subject matter and energize themselves. Tons of men will walk through the door who wouldn't have walked through the door. And what will happen is when they walk through the door, they'll realize how little they know about a subject that is so important. And they'll understand how directly connected, for example, men's violence against women is directly connected to men's violence against other men, which is also directly connected to men's violence against themselves, because suicide is violence turned inward. And so the average guy who doesn't know any of this, right, he doesn't know that in the field people have been thinking this through for decades. So, because guys will say often, what about violence against men? As if that people like myself and others, yourselves, don't understand that domestic and sexual violence is connected to men's violence against men on the streets and gang violence and the rates of suicide among men are connected also to men's violence against women and other men. I mean, it's all intersecting and interconnected, and the solutions have to be similarly sophisticated. But the point is, the guys wouldn't know any of this if they didn't walk through the door. And they're not going to walk through the door unless we say, we expect you to walk through the door because you're a leader and this is part of being a good leader.
Yeah. So Jackson, just kind of reflecting now on what you just said, that for us accountability is a really loaded word in our work. It's often used by people to kind of make these announcements around holding men who use violence, domestic and family violence, sexual violence against women accountable. And we absolutely have to do that. And we know that when we start doing the kind of really intricate and careful work with men who are using violence, we're actually supporting them to know what accountability is and to become accountable to themselves and to their families. And, you know, what I'm hearing you say is, and what we've been sort of having some conversations about is, we need everyone to be accountable. We need to be government and leaders to be accountable. We need systems to be accountable to families and to communities. We need community members to be accountable. So, you know, I think we've talked a little bit about that, but I'm just interested if you've got any further thoughts on this notion of accountability.
Sure, and accountability is a really important concept. It's also a kind of a cousin to the concept of responsibility.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be responsible? Not just accountable, but responsible. And honestly, I think maybe one thing might be helpful is I often talk about the difference between, especially for men, between guilt and responsibility.
Yes.
And I think a lot of men feel like the conversation about men's violence against women is kind of guilt-tripping men and trying to make men feel guilty for being men. And I'm not talking about men who use violence in their relationships, I mean more generally. And by the way, this is also true with racism. Like you'll hear in the States, lots of conservative white people saying that talking about racism in American history and present is somehow making white young people feel guilty about being white, and so there's a pushback. Part of the backlash is we're not going to let you make you social justice warriors and you feminists and racial justice activists. We're not going to let you make our white kids feel guilty for being white, or our sons make them feel guilty for being men. And so I address this in a lot of my talks, and I say, let me just be clear. I don't feel guilty for being white. I was born, okay? Who I am. That's who I am. I'm not making any apologies. I don't feel guilty for being heterosexual. I just happen to be who I am, and I don't feel guilty for being a man. I was born this way. On the other hand, I feel responsible as a white person in a society and in a world where there's so much racism. I feel I'm responsible to work for racial justice, or I'm a hypocrite or a coward, neither of which I want to be or see myself as. So I have no choice. I have to work for racial justice because it's what I believe in. And that's a sense of responsibility, not guilt. And similarly, I'm going to say about men, about being a man. I don't feel guilty for being a man, but I do surely feel responsible as a man to speak out and do whatever I can to reduce men's violence against women and misogyny. It's both on the micro level of interpersonally around me, but also to the extent that I can help to shape societal, practice and norms in my work as an educator or an author or whatever. It's like I feel responsible, yes. And the good thing about framing the difference between guilt and responsibility is that I think guilt is an immobilizing emotion. In other words, a lot of people who feel guilty retreat because they feel guilty, or they don't feel like they're authorized to speak. But at least responsibility has potential, the opposite effect. In other words, it's active. In other words, and it's like it has the potential for people to say, I feel responsible, therefore I'm going to do something. And both responsible for my own behavior, but also it's not just my own behavior, because a lot of men will say on this subject matter, as you know, Lizette, a lot of men will say, I personally don't abuse women. I would never rape a woman. I don't harass women. Why should I have to be caring about this? Or why should you call this an issue for me? Why is it a men's issue? Or shouldn't it just be the men who are doing these horrible things? It's their responsibility. Me, I'm a good guy. This is what most men say. And most men say to this day in 2024. And I've been working on this matter for, 35 years. That's the focus of my work, is the guy who says, I'm a good guy, this isn't my issue. Because everybody has to be involved. And I have my book coming out early next year. It's called Every Man, Why Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue. And that's directly a response to the not all men hashtag, where men would say, not all men are rapists, not all men are abusers, as if anybody ever said that all men were. But I'm saying every man has a role to play. Not every man has a big public platform. Not every man is the head of some powerful institution. I understand that. There's men at all levels of society. But every man has something to do about this subject. Every man can challenge. For example, a 16-year-old boy whose friend just told a rape joke can turn to his friend and say, hey, dude, can you joke about something else? I don't find that funny. That 16-year-old boy might not be a leader in any formal sense. He might not have some credential next to his name, but what he just did was a leadership act. And he said, it's my responsibility to not perpetuate the attitudes that lead to sexual violence, one of which is boys and men making jokes about sexual violence against women as if it's something to be joked about. To me, that's a specific example of how men at all levels can play a constructive role.
And I think that kind of what I call, excuse making, or, as you say, it's got nothing to do with me, so I don't see why it should matter. For me, we're talking about human rights, and I've always been interested in how do we tap into people's inner selves that actually does spark and says, yeah, I actually have a responsibility around the incursions on human rights. And we see it happening all the time where, a blind eye is turned, or people are collusive or complicit by not doing that. These are kind of big sort of questions that roll around for me, having worked as well, in the sector in violence against women and girls for, 30, 35, 38 years, and specifically for like over 20 years working with men. And really kind of wondering, what is it that just supports people to turn away in those moments rather than turn in and lean in?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that very much. I would say, again, I know there's multi-dimensions to this, so I don't want to over-determine one, but I do think that many men are afraid of other men's disapproval, and they're not always afraid of violence. I don't think violence is a realistic fear in most cases. On the streets it is, by the way. One of the reasons why men, when they see situations happening, like, domestic violence incidents in public spaces or men harassing women, I think in public spaces, one of the reasons why people hesitate, including men, is because of fear of violent retribution. And I know that's true, and it's true in my country with all the guns that are circulating, so you could literally do the right thing and get killed in the next 10 seconds. It's really horrible. But most of my work doesn't focus on public spaces where you encounter strangers. It's about peer cultures that people know each other on teams, in groups, in school, in workplaces, in families, in extended networks, in communities where people know each other. A lot of guys don't speak up, not because they're afraid of violent retribution from other men, but they're worried about social disapproval. They're worried about losing status among their friends or their peers. They're worried about socially awkward interactions. They're worried that they won't be seen as one of the guys. And one of the things that I often say, especially to adult men, is that it's not fair to put the burden of leadership on boys and young men who have intense pressure on them to conform, to fit in. They're always looking over their shoulder. What am I wearing? How am I talking? Am I seen as cool or not cool? Is this masculine or not masculine? It's so many pressures on young men and boys. It's not fair for them to be expected to be the leaders on this if adult men aren't willing to do it or model the behavior or support the behavior. And so I think that adult men have a responsibility to our sons and to young men. Of course, we have a responsibility to women as well. And non-binary people. But I'm just saying, adult men have a powerful role to play. And again, when I say this leadership, when I use this concept of leadership, about men's leadership, one of the responsibilities we have is to create a model that young men, it'll take the pressure off of young men. Because I think a lot of young men know, for example, that a behavior around them is not cool, but they don't speak up because they know that there are going to be consequences to speaking up. And so those of us who are adults, especially those of us who have a bigger platform, we can create some space to make it more acceptable, give them permission to speak up.
Jackson, I'm really interested to hear some of your thoughts on why men actually engage in violence prevention work. what are some of the qualities or some of the motivations that you have seen over the years?
Well, I mean, it's a fundamental issue of human rights and justice. I mean, for some of us, it doesn't have to get even that much more complicated than that. To me, if you care about justice and fairness and, enlightenment values, human dignity, human rights, and you look around, you can see that misogyny and men's violence against women is a direct affront to human rights, social justice, fairness, nonviolence, and all these other, sort of abstract but important concepts that we many of us claim to believe in. So to me, it's that simple. And by the way, I know this is going a little bit further than your question implied, but there are influential figures out there who mock men like myself, who mock men who speak up and support feminist change and feminist activism and gender equality. I'll give you an example. Jordan Peterson ridicules men like me. I heard Jordan Peterson say recently, and I'm very familiar with Jordan Peterson's work. Okay, so I've never met Jordan Peterson, but I'm very familiar with his work. I heard him say recently that men who support feminist women are basically beta males who are trying to have sex with women and trying to curry favor with women to get laid, right? Because they're not impressive enough to attract women, but if they kind of pretend that they really care about women's rights, they can sort of insinuate themselves in, and then women will find them attractive because they care about their issues. This is so embarrassing to me to hear a serious public intellectual talk like a teenage boy. When I started speaking out on these matters when I was 19, this is what I would hear from some guys, like, you don't really believe that shit, do you? That's not really something you're serious about, like women's rights. It's like, you're just trying to get laid, aren't you? It's like, and then to hear, this is like 40 years ago, and then to hear someone like Jordan Peterson say it, it's embarrassing to me. And he should be embarrassed. But I'm saying that this is what we're dealing with. I mean, now Jordan Peterson is a more sophisticated, individual, although some of the things he says are deeply problematic. But then you have the Andrew Tates of the world, and you have the even more cartoonish examples of men out there in the manosphere and in other parts of social media that have had enormous influence on young men and boys over the last number of years. And one of the things that they say, the Andrew Tates of the world and the Jordan Petersons of the world say to young men is they'll say, I care about you. We care about you. We respect you. Stand up straight. In the case of Andrew Tate, he explicitly says the solution to men's struggles is to take back control of women. Don't let women push you around. You're the man. You need to protect and control your girlfriend or your wife, because that's what real men do. And that's not only is that cartoonish, it's also dangerous, and it's also a complete setup, because you have whole generations of women. I'm making a really general statement. You have whole generations of women who are being taught to embrace their own power, if you will, to be treated, to demand to be treated with respect and dignity. And then you have young men who are being told by the Andrew Tates of the world and the misogynist manosphere, and to a certain extent, although it's more complicated, the Jordan Petersons of the world, that feminism is anti-male. It's not real. It denies like in Jordan Peterson's case, he talks about the individual, the sovereign individual is all that matters. When you start talking about groups and feminism is a group-based analysis, you're sliding down into cultural Marxism. And if we go that direction, we could end up in Soviet totalitarianism. This is crazy to me. This is crazy, but this is what we're fighting against. So when we're talking to men and young men and trying to engage them, there's this counter narrative out there that has taken hold. And I would say one of the things that many of us on the sort of progressive side of the house, the pro-feminist side of the house, we haven't done it well enough, is we haven't created a narrative that young men can feel part of the positive changes. Because if all they're hearing, and not just young men, if all they're hearing is this narrative about toxic masculinity and men are horrible and men are, doing these horrible things, especially white men, if they're hearing that from us, and then what they're hearing from the right of the spectrum and the men's rights side of the spectrum is, we love you, we respect you, you need to take control back from women, and you need to dismiss these feminist challenges, and you need to plod on. If that's the binary choice that men and young men feel like they're having, they're often going to go down the wrong path as far as I'm concerned. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have a crisis in democracy in the world, especially in Europe and the United States, because a lot of young men and white men are really angry about what they understand to be losing control of the narrative, losing cultural centrality. And they see in figures like Donald Trump, for example, while some of us look at him as a cartoonish con man, other people look at him as like, this is a guy who's really telling the truth. This is a guy who's really standing up. He fights back. He doesn't bend the knee. He's aggressive, and no matter what you throw at him, he'll stand back up. He won't kowtow to feminists and racial justice activists. Anyhow, I know I've gone off on that, but
I think
it's
it's
all
really
part of
important,
it.
and it's really important around, it's that threat to traditional masculinity, which is being baked in for, thousands of years.
That's right. That's
which is
right.
Patriarchy. And, how we are now looking at how we are reimagining masculinity,
Right.
and what is that going to look like. And I think, that fear factor is so huge, and when people tap into that and go, come over here because we're all good, we're all going to kind of keep tight. We're going to keep tight with that old school.
Right.
And the fear of actually moving into this unknown space about what that might look like.
That's right. And I appreciate your using the word fear, because I think it is fear. But another concept that I think that might be useful to think about is, and it's been pioneered by an African American woman whose name is American. Mm. Her name is Loretta Ross. She's a longtime reproductive justice activist and anti-rape, anti-DV activist, and now she's a professor at Smith College, which is an elite, prestigious women's college in Massachusetts. She talks about calling in good behavior versus calling out bad behavior.
I love that.
And I think, right, it's another reframe, because I think a lot of men, especially, or accelerated with the Me Too movement, have felt like a kind of a defensive stance in the face of being called out for bad behavior. And what she's saying is calling in good behavior is often a more constructive way for change to happen than always calling out bad behavior. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that people don't need to be accountable for their behavior. And then we're back to the conversation about accountability. So men who use violence, it's not just calling them into good behavior. There's got to be consequences and accountability for bad behavior, especially violent behavior. But in a general sense, if we're approaching men and young men with a spirit of calling them in to being leaders, to being responsible citizens, being, sons of the Enlightenment who care about democracy and freedom and human rights, which includes feminism, by the way, is human rights 101. Feminism is democracy 101. I mean, to me, the idea that you can say you believe in democracy and not be a feminist is an oxymoron. To me, feminism is democracy 101. And how do you reconcile saying I believe in democracy but I don't believe in feminism?
That's right.
So it seems so
Half
obvious.
of you don't count.
I'm sorry?
Half of you don't count.
Right. It seems obvious.
It's so crazy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but by the way, let's be clear. There are people who don't believe in democracy. There are fascists.
Yes.
And those fascists are anti-feminist. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that in the rise of right-wing movements in Europe, the United States, and even here, that a constituent part, an important constituent part of the rise of right-wing movements is an enshrinement of men's control over women. And not just in the public space, but in the private space, in the family. Yes. Can I also say, Lizette, one of the things that I think is really important, at least to get into the public conversation, is the domestic and sexual violence movements have given us so much insight into not just interpersonal relationships, but on a bigger stage. And about power and control, and how and issues of democracy. I just wrote an article that was published in the spring issue of Ms. Magazine that talks about what's talked about as the crisis in masculinity, is really a crisis in democracy, because so many men, in the face of these complex changes that have been happening in our societies, like in Australia, the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of Australia. I was walking the streets of Melbourne yesterday. It was like unbelievably racially diverse.
It's wonderful.
This is a new country, yes.
Yeah.
And it is wonderful, but there are people who are threatened by that. And while some of us look at increases in women in the corporate boardrooms, I mean, it's nowhere near parity. I know this, but who look at the increases in women's success in terms of traditionally male occupations, some of us say this is great. This is improving the human condition. It's also fundamentally fair that women have the equal opportunity and rights to compete at all levels, but it also helps Australian society thrive. Some of us are really jazzed by that and inspired, but we have to be honest. Some people are defensive about this and they're threatened by it, and they're fighting back pretty strongly.
Yeah.
And anyways, the domestic and sexual violence movement has given us so much insight into like the motivations, like what on a micro level, for example, why would a man need his needs to be so front and center that he has to use force to get her compliance or punish her for transgressing? If he's confident, if he's healthy, if he's a person that has any sort of balance in his psyche, like live and let live, why would he be so obsessed with that kind of control? And is it genetically programmed into the male at birth? I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I think it's imposed on male children or boys and men by ideology, by belief systems. And those belief systems don't just happen linearly within families.
No.
There are all these other influences. And so one of the ways that all men need to play a role, back to my thesis that it is every man, it is all men, is we have to figure out ways that we're all contributing to the status quo, even if we ourselves would never use violence in an intimate relationship. How are we participating in perpetuating some of the institutions of the society that keep the status quo in place? And I'll give you just one example.
Yeah.
The porn culture.
Oh my God. We can't go down that hole, but absolutely 100%.
Yes.
Huge.
Right. And the level of misogyny embedded in the normative heterosexual porn, not the extremes, but the mainstream. And so how can guys say that if they use porn, they consume porn, they don't criticize it, they don't say anything about it, and yet we know that it's extraordinarily influential in lives of young men, especially in this case, young heterosexual men, in shaping their attitudes and beliefs about girls and women, and about even sex itself. How can we say that that's not part of the problem? And then how can we say that our silence is doing anything other than helping to perpetuate the status quo?
We become complicit.
Yes, we become complicit. So what's the solution to silence's complicity? Breaking the silence and speaking up. And the person who speaks up is often a leader, because often if you're a man or a young man, if you speak up, you're often not just speaking for yourself, you're often speaking for other men and young men who are already unhappy with some of the behavior around them, but for whatever reason they haven't been able to speak, they haven't taken their first step forward. And a leader is a person who takes the step forward when other people won't, right?
It's such a beautiful way to end our conversation, to circle back to the leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the conversation and for giving me the opportunity to share some of my ideas. I appreciate it very much, Lizette.
Wonderful, thank you.